I'm extremely pleased that as part of our 2020 UAM 9/11 Remembrance event, we are able to have a Zoom session with Chester Johnson, and we would like to talk to him about his experiences in New York, both in 9/11, but also recently with the COVID pandemic, and his thoughts about community in the midst of disasters. So I turn the microphone over to you, and then after you've talked to us for a while, we'll see if there are any questions for you. So welcome, and thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you, Carol, and also I want to thank UAM for inviting me to make this or to participate in this talk, I would say, because as I indicated, I expected this to be quite informal, and that's the way I'm approaching it, because maybe I can answer questions that would be of particular note to the group as a whole. Before I start to talk about either of those terrible events affecting New York City, I thought I'd give a little bit of a couple of statistics that might prove helpful. Taking 9/11, there were a little less than 2,800 people who died at the World Trade Center site. There were a little over 2,600 who were working in or living around Ground Zero who died. But then there was an additional number of people on those two flights who died. And so the amount is, the number is a little less than 2,800. As of Monday of this week, there were 23,721 persons from New York City who have died from the COVID-19. So, in proportion, the COVID-19 pandemic or plague is nearly about 8.5 times as great from the pandemic and from 9/11. Now, to put another, I think, an important statistic in mind is that the population of New York City is 8.5 million people, which represents about 2.6% of the U.S. population. And yet, when you look at the total number of U.S. deaths, as I said, as of Monday, the number of persons who have died in New York City from COVID represents about 12.5% of the total U.S. deaths. So there are a couple of things to be drawn from those statistics. One is that clearly the pandemic has had a much more devastating effect on New York City than 9/11 did in terms of the number of deaths. And then number two, when you look at this nationally, it is clear that New York City constitutes a major component of the number of persons who have died from this disease, this virus. The other thing to keep in mind is that the impact of the pandemic on the city as a whole has been much more pervasive and felt in all parts of the city in a way that 9/11 didn't. 9/11 was very localized. It was downtown in the World Trade Center site, where the two planes had crashed into the two World Trade Center towers, and then the the two towers coming down had an immediate impact on the immediately adjacent areas. That's really not the case with the pandemic. It is spread throughout the city. Certain boroughs, New York City consists of 5 boroughs. All of them have been hit, but some more than others. Brooklyn, Queens, pardon me, and the Bronx in particular have been hit. I live in Manhattan, which is this one island surrounded by New Jersey. Pardon me, I'm water. But also the other boroughs, Long Island, Queens, and Brooklyn are located on Long Island and north of the city, more in terms of New York State, adjacent to the upstate area, being the Bronx, and then Manhattan is surrounded by, Manhattan's an island. Now, I'll just talk a little bit about the pandemic personally. It has had, my wife and I have lived in Manhattan for many years. And while the early effects were quite dramatic on 9/11, they were not quite as personally dramatic. For example, we haven't been able to see, we have a grandchild in Connecticut, and since March, we haven't been able to travel outside, and that's it's a result of the city being in lockdown in large measure. Because one area that's important is that, to bear in mind, is that because of the statistics that I cited and others, I mean, New York City has something like 74,000 people per square mile, and in Manhattan. But as a historical fact, it's doubled every day because you have people commuting in to Manhattan and then leaving at the end of the day. Why do I point that out? Because it's important from looking at how dense New York City and Manhattan in particular are. So therefore, during a normal day, there are 150,000 people per square mile in Manhattan, which is very, very dense. You can sort of imagine that. 150,000 people, and that's per square mile. And that contributed in a major way. I'm going to talk about the pandemic for a moment. Major way in terms of the infection process that spread throughout throughout Manhattan. And of course, because of Manhattan or New York City being a transportation hub for the country as a whole, if not for the world, we experienced the intrusion of the virus very early in February and March in particular. And we thought, and I talk about sort of the city as a whole, we thought that most of this was coming in from China. Of course, that wasn't the case. There was no reduction in terms of travel from Europe. And that's where the infection really expanded substantially. People flying in to Kennedy or to Newark and bringing that virus with them. And because of the density that is experienced in this city, it just spread like wildfire. So that period of March, April, and May were really quite severe for everyone living here. I mean, as a result of what happened in 9/11, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, I developed this. I was a volunteer at the Relief Center for the Recovery Workers on 9/11. And we sort of believed what everybody was telling us, that the air was fine and all that. But I worked as a volunteer on the weekends from Saturday night until Sunday morning. And after a while, I really developed very serious, very significant respiratory problems. And I'm part of the World Trade Center Health Monitoring and Treatment Program. And if you heard me speak maybe 10 years ago, I mean, no, it's longer than that. But let's say back in 1990s, I wouldn't sound exactly as nasal as I do now. But I'm under strict doctor's orders to stay in because my immunity is compromised. And I've only been out of my apartment once since March. My wife, who didn't have as much exposure as I did 9/11 afterwards, she's been out 4 or 5 times. But so my point is that I might have 2 points here. One is that for me personally, and in turn for my wife, 9/11 and the pandemic are actually connected because lifestyle for us hasn't really changed that. It has the impact of 9/11 still was accelerated through the experience of the pandemic. And so we have been restricted substantially here. I mentioned about not seeing my grandchild, my daughter who lives in Washington, D.C. We haven't been able to see her. And as a matter of fact, this is much more isolated than we felt after 9/11. And we do. I mean, just to tell you what our life is like. I mean, our apartment has sort of pieces of our apartment have turned into sort of an inventory of what we may need, because not everything is available. More things are available now than they were during March, for example. I mean, there were lots of paper products that were not available then, and if we needed, my wife is really good at tracking stuff down, and so she would buy in bulk, and so that we would have them on hand. But even now, and I don't know what it's like in Monticello, but we can't get wipes, sanitized wipes or that sort of thing. We can't. We just can't get that. That's not available. And when it is available, it's used for health facilities here. And we have to wash everything that comes to our door. I mean, the grocery stores around here deliver, but they deliver to our door, and then we wait some time because the infection is, this is airborne, so the infection is something we have to be concerned about, even when someone delivers. If they, for example, didn't wear their mask, then we have to be especially concerned about airborne, possibly virus. And so, but then we need to wash down everything that we get. And then we wash it all down. We generally set it aside and live with the anticipated number of days that pass. And that you probably are going through a similar situation, but it's it's a little distressing to have to do that every time we get food delivery or we get packages. I'm a writer, so I need lots of paper around, and so I have to, when I get stuff. I know, for example, I have a Staples delivery outside our door, outside of our apartment, and tomorrow, Friday or tomorrow, no, it'll have to be Saturday. We'll wash down a lot of the stuff that's delivered. I'm sorry, I'm just sort of, I don't know if this is of help or not, but it's, but that has been and we have to be very sensitive to shortages and trying to track things down. So in many ways, the pandemic and the 9/11 are tied, but we're are tied together, and we're probably exceptional that way because our age, we've been involved. We were involved in both, and I still carry the effects of 9/11, and I have to be really sensitive because my immunity system is compromised, and I'm under a pretty severe protocol from the World Trade Center Health Monitoring and Treatment Program. We are also located about halfway, about 10 blocks north is Mount Sinai Hospital, and 10 blocks south of us is Lenox Hill, and both of those hospitals were particularly involved in this pandemic. I don't know if you saw anything on television about these temporary hospital or beds that were set up under tents in Central Park. Well, that was right across from where Mount Sinai is located. And you probably, or you may have seen those refrigerated transport trucks that were in. That was set. Those trucks were outside of Lenox Hill Hospital because there were so many people dying so quickly. They needed refrigeration for where the corpses would be deposited, and that's just 10 blocks on each side of us. So during that period of time, it's not an exaggeration to say that we really had hard time sleeping because it was constant ambulance sirens going on, either taking someone to Mount Sinai or taking someone to Lenox Hill. Now, as a result of the positivity rate going down in a substantial way in New York City, as you may have read or watched, we are really fortunate. We had a hell of a time. It was hell in New York City for better part of 2.5 months. But the positivity rate now is well under 3%, which is, when you look at it just in the last few months, that's just miraculous in many ways. But during that time, that really was a reminder of the world in which we lived at that time. Now, maybe a few more comments, and then I'll open it up for questions. But looking at it sort of on a national basis, the pandemic, 9/11, from a physical effect perspective, was not national in scope. It was local. It was, a very small group in Pennsylvania. The Pentagon was hit. I think a little over, maybe around 100 persons who died there. But the main part of it was downtown Manhattan, World Trade Center sites. And which has made the event, from my perspective, considerably different from 9/11. 9/11 actually brought us as a country, and certainly as a city, together in a way that was, and New York City had, there was an image about New York City after 9/11 that's different than it is now. And it really brought the country together. The pandemic has, seems to me, and the political forces around it, has really altered that we have become more divisive. And so this terrible event of the pandemic, I would have, as a general matter, we're sort of brought together when these events happen, but it's become more political than on a national basis than what happened after 9/11. I want to spend a few minutes about my experience 9/11, and because it was very personal, and I was in many ways, fortunate to participate in the way that I did. The Relief Center for the Recovery Workers was St. Paul's Chapel, which is located right across the street from the North Tower. North Tower was hit first on 9/11, but it actually came down second of the buildings, the towers that came down. And St. Paul's Chapel is located directly across the street from North Tower. And miraculously, really nothing happened. St. Paul's Chapel to it physically. There wasn't a window broken. There wasn't a stone dislodged. It was really, in many ways, a miraculous event. Now, you can say that, although there were all these sycamore trees that surrounded it and really actually protected it from the sheathing that came off of the World Trade Center that bounced from the World Trade Center site across the street. But even also, as the floors came down, there was tremendous pressure placed on these bolts that kept the floors in place previously. And so when the pressure came down and those bolts fired out from the World Trade Center, both towers, they were really literally destroying buildings all around them. This isn't really, people don't pay a lot of attention to that, but that's really created an enormous destruction for buildings downtown and around Ground Zero. But the interesting thing is that St. Paul's Chapel wasn't damaged at all. St. Paul's Chapel has an important part in history. When George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States, New York City was actually the capital at that time. And he was sworn in at the corner of Wall and Broad, Nassau and Wall. And the government walked up to St. Paul's Chapel, and there was a worship service after the first president was sworn in, and the government came with him. There were, the cabinet members and vice president and all of the rest came up. And then St. Paul's Chapel was George Washington's church for the first 2 years before it moved to Philadelphia and then Washington, D.C. So it's the oldest publicly used building in New York City. It's the oldest church building in New York City. So there's a lot of history around it. I had a chance, and I at the time I was on the governing board of an important organization here in New York City called Trinity Church Wall Street, and and I became this liaison between Trinity Wall Street, which actually owns St. Paul's Chapel. It's an Episcopal church, one of the oldest in the country, and in St. Paul's Chapel. St. Paul's operates underneath it. And I started volunteering, and I wouldn't have had that kind of opportunity because there were people from all over the country who came in to work and to assist with the relief center activities, because there were workers out on the pile, the police, fire, construction workers, all of that, trying to clean up the pile. And they would take breaks and come to St. Paul's Chapel, and St. Paul's Chapel had food, and people could sleep in the pews, and wonderful stories about it, and there were surrounding it, and it also became at that time there was no museum, of course, and while the volunteer effort was going on, there was only really one place people could go to sort of grieve and spend time dealing with this terrible event that had to the country. People would come in it was surrounded by a fence, and people would be 5 and 6 people deep just there to experience what St. Paul's Chapel was. And so about, I would say, starting in February of 2002, I started working on this poem that reflects the experience I had. And by the summer, it had been published in a national journal. And then when it was reopened, I didn't know it was going to happen, but because I just went down to see what it was like on the day because there were 3 months from the time of the final cleanup occurred in April of 2002, and then this was reopened on September the 11th, 2002. So because it was an absolutely filthy place, it had never been cleaned up after 9/11, so there was lots of dirt and dust and all of that in that place of service to others. But it got cleaned up, and so I went down to be part of the opening, and people coming in from all over. And someone had put up my poem in the chapel, and it's been there ever since. But it's gone through sort of several iterations in terms of the way in which it's presented. It's been the memento card at St. Paul's Chapel ever since. About 1.5 million cards have been distributed. So I'll read that, and then we can pick up some conversation. I'll promote it to some extent, and that is that the American Book Review has stated that my poem, St. Paul's Chapel, is one of the most widely distributed, lauded, and translated poems of the current century. So I'll read it. It's called St. Paul's Chapel. It stood, not a window broken, not a stone dislodged. It stood when nothing else did. It stood when terrorists brought September down. It stood among myths. It stood among ruins. To stand was its purpose. Long lines prove that. It stands, and around it now a shrine of letters, poems, acrostics, litter of the heart. It is the standing people want. Grieve, serve, and tend, celebrate the lasting stone of St. Paul's Chapel. And deep into its thick breath, the largest banner, fittingly from Oklahoma, climbs heavenward with hands as stars, hands as stripes, hands as a flag. And a rescuer reaches for a stuffed toy to collect a touch. And George Washington's pew doesn't go unused. Charity fills a hole or two. It stood in place of other sorts. It stood when nothing else could. The great had fallen as the brute hardware came down. It stood. I'm going to read it tomorrow. Tomorrow there's a group made up of those who were first responders or volunteers like myself. And we have what's called calling of the names, and it's those people who were first responders who assisted in ground zero, and who experienced actually St. Paul's Chapel as the relief center. And we call out the names of those who have died since 9/11, and most of those, well, a large number of them died as a result of their exposure at ground zero. And so for the last 5 years, we've been doing this, we've been having this event. And it usually it ends, I'll read my poem, and then there's a song that has been associated with St. Paul's Chapel. So I think that's it. If anyone's interested, I didn't mention this, I should have, but during the course of what's happened with the pandemic, I had a book published. It's called Damaged Heritage, The Elaine Race Massacre and a Story of Reconciliation. And you may or may not find it interesting, all of the adjustments we've had to make in terms of the marketing and the outreach and the presentations that would normally occur with respect to a new book being launched. It's published by Pegasus and distributed by Simon and Schuster. But if you're not interested, I won't talk about it. So anyway, that's all I had to say in terms of the remarks I expected to make. And maybe this went a little longer than you expected it to, and I'm sorry if it did.
Oh, that's not a problem at all. We are very, very touched by your reading of the poem and what you told us. I collectively say thank you so much. I've read that poem several times, but to actually hear you read it was really quite an experience. And
thank you.
And I actually was going to ask you to talk about the reading of the names. I will tell you that we're putting that link on our website, and so everyone here can actually hear the reading of the names and hear you read the poem again tomorrow if they visit the website. The link will be provided for them. So I think that's another touching moment that you have actually provided for us. I'm actually interested in your book. So if you would like to, and I think I'm probably not the only person in here who's interested in your book, if you'd like to say a few more words about the book that you've published, I think we would like to hear them. So
okay, good. Well, I'll tell you about the book, and then I'll tell you about what's been sort of interesting, the changes that we had to implement when a book came out right in the middle of the pandemic. The book is, I said, is called Damaged Heritage, The Elaine Race Massacre and a Story of Reconciliation. The Elaine Race Massacre occurred in Arkansas. And does anyone, tell me how many people are familiar with the Elaine Race Massacre? Oh, quite a few. Okay, good. Well, a few years ago, I was asked to write the litany, which is a piece that is used in a religious ceremony. It was the Episcopal Church apologized for its role in slavery and related evils, and they asked me to write basically the service for it, and which is called a litany, and which I did. And as I was doing my work, I came across an event that happened. I grew up in Monticello, and in Drew County. And Drew County is one county removed. Shea County is a county between Phillips County and Drew. The Elaine Race Massacre occurred in Elaine, and a pretty famous historian and anti-lynching advocate, Ida B. Wells. She wrote a treatise on it, and it was one of the things I've read as I was writing the litany, and I couldn't believe it because I'd lived so close to it and I'd never heard about it. And in fact, it could be the most significant attack against African Americans in our country's history. And here I didn't hear about it. I didn't know about it in school. I didn't hear about it at church. I didn't hear it any place. So I started doing a lot of research. And as I went through it, I found that my grandfather had participated in the massacre. He, at that time, he was living in McGee. His family, they were farmers in the Shea County, but he didn't like the idea of farming. So he early on joined the Missouri Pacific Railroad. And that's all he worked for them throughout his entire working career. And the Missouri Pacific Railroad was up to its eyeballs. And at the time of the massacre, McGee was the hub of Southeast Arkansas for the railroad. Anyway, I got more and more interested in it. And then a friend of mine whose family lived in generations in Phillips County, he and I thought, there really should be a memorial. It's just too important. There wasn't a memorial. And in fact, it had basically been forgotten. I mean, there have been some books written about it, but, if you ask a normal person on the street, have you ever heard of the Elaine Race Massacre? No one would have about it. And so anyway, I ended up being the co-chair for the memorial. And last September, it was dedicated in Helena, which is the county seat. So the first part of the book is sort of a summary of the massacre itself. But the rest of it is memoir on my experiences in dealing with race in Southeast Arkansas. And more particularly, commentary on race, on terms of thoughts that I have about it and racial reconciliation. There was an African American woman whose ancestors were victims of the massacre. Her name is Sheila Walker, and she wrote the foreword to the book. And we became friends in 2014 because we represented two sides of the massacre, and there was another writer that put us together. And we immediately became very close friends. There was a symposium, coincidentally, at St. Paul's Chapel back in latter part of 2014, for several months after we had gotten to know each other well. And she announced at this symposium that she and I were two of four speakers, and she announced that she forgave my grandfather, whose name was Lonnie Birch. She forgave Lonnie more than I had. And the forgiveness that she gave opened up a relationship for Sheila and me, and Sheila's family and my family, that was just extraordinary. And so I talk about that in terms of the way in which all of that came together. And I offer some guidance, I think guidance. And it has become a pretty, I've really been surprised by the amount of attention that it has got now, admittedly, with national environment being what it is. But it is written by, a white Southerner, and I don't know exactly how that would be responded, although, as I said, it's a story of there's a story within the book, there's this story of reconciliation. And it's not there now, but a few weeks ago, I got notified that it was number 3 as Amazon bestseller for biographies of social activists. And number 2 is Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. And it was, at that time, it was ahead of Meacham's book on John Lewis. But it's fallen a little bit. It's primarily in, the rankings deal with Kindle, because most people are buying their books. Not everybody, but a lot of folks are buying their books over Kindle as opposed to hard copy. But I'm very pleased with the results of the book, and I speak quite a bit about the book. People are interested in knowing more about the book, and so but sort of segueing into. By the way, I could talk for the whole day about the book, so I'd better cut myself off. It was really interesting. The book was released on May the 5th, right in the middle of the pandemic, particularly for New York City. Bookstores got closed all over the country. Travel was obviously restricted, so I couldn't go out and make presentations in person any place and have book signings and that sort of thing. So we concluded, the publishers, Simon and Schuster distributed the book, and a group of us, we decided that we would focus on 3 things. Radio interviews, where we had just a passel of them. I think it's over 35 at this point. Zoom presentations, and there have been very large number of churches involved who really wanted to have this book described to them. So there's been although I've spoken non-churches too. I mean, like the Carter Center in Atlanta and other places, but it's so Zoom presentations mainly, although there are other, and radio interviews, and then my writing a few articles have been published here and there. But so that's where we've had to focus our efforts as opposed to the conventional way. But it has, my own view is that Zoom is not going to go away. Zoom is going to stay in place from now on, and I think that that's going to be a way in which books get marketed in the future.
It certainly allowed us to have a session with you. We have, I know you were very busy person, and we have another group coming into the room. But I think we've got probably another minute or two if there's any pressing questions that anyone wants to ask. Well, with that, I would like us to thank our wonderful esteemed speaker for spending this time with us today. So thank you very much. It's been a wonderful experience.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, even though you will not see me. And
Right.
other people will join in as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, I'll bid you goodbye. Thank you.
And thank you so much.